So here's a question from Ian. Jonathan, do you want to relate this to Ian Schemmel asked around whether this is the same as different effect size metrics, the ATE versus the ATT, which is the average treatment effect versus the average effect.
Okay, so Ian, we're going to say the focus here is going to be on the intention to treat effect, which you might think of as the average effect of treatment in individuals assigned to experimental intervention. Sorry, the average outcome in individuals assigned to experimental intervention compared with the average outcome in individuals assigned to the comparator intervention. We will say a little bit about ways in which we might estimate the effect of adhering to intervention. And when we do that, and especially if we relate that to modern developments in causal inference, we might talk about things like the average effect of treatment in the treated, or ATT. I think that is beyond what we need to talk about in the context of most Cochrane reviews. And so we're not going to get into that during this seminar, although I think there are very interesting discussions about the precise definitions that are required when we try to estimate the per protocol effect, the effects of adhering to intervention. But for the purposes of what we're going to talk about here, we're mainly focusing on the effect of assignment to intervention, the ITT effect. Back to you, Julie.
I think that's all the questions that we have arisen so far. Oh,
sorry,
Ella?
just to add, Ruth asked a question about.
I see that. Yes.
So we have. Go on, over to you, Julian.
So sorry, Ella. So it says the question is: so the effect of interest just depends on who you're asking, or is it important what they were asking in the trial? So I guess this is getting at, is it the reviewer's decision or the trialist's decision? And that's really interesting.
That's a great question. Thank you. So in terms of ROB2, it's for the reviewer to say what the effect that they against which, in relation to which, they are assessing the risk of bias. As we'll say later on, the risk there are much more complicated considerations when we assess the risk of bias and the effect of adhering to intervention, compared to the quite simple considerations when we assess the risk of bias in the ITT effect, the effect of assignment to intervention, for this domain. So it's for the reviewer to specify, but there is a relationship between what the reviewer specifies and what the trial reported. So, for example, if all the trial had reported was an intention to treat analysis done in the right way, then, and which is usually going to happen, then we would expect that the review author, the team doing the risk of bias assessments, will say that they are assessing the effect of assignment to intervention. And that's the point that's made on the slide that you can see. Cochrane reviews will usually assess the effect of assignment to intervention, the intention to treat effect. When we are estimating, when trial authors are estimating the intention to treat effect, and that will usually be their primary analysis, they should use an intention to treat analysis. What do we have to do an intention to treat analysis? We need to analyze participants in the intervention groups to which they were randomized, regardless of the intervention received. So it doesn't matter if somebody was assigned to take a drug but chose never to take it, they are randomized in the group to which they were assigned. Importantly, we should also include all randomized participants in the analysis. We shouldn't exclude anybody, as we do in a naive per protocol analysis. And we should measure outcome data on all participants, which of course may not be possible. Now, trial authors may report multiple results. And so if we're assessing the effect of assignment to intervention in our ROB2 assessment, we may have a choice of results for which we're assessing risk of bias. Fairly obviously, when we're assessing the risk of bias in the effect of assignment to intervention, we should choose the result, if possible, corresponding to a full intention to treat analysis. However, it may be that the trial authors were not able to measure outcomes in all participants, and so the next best thing when we're assessing the risk of bias in the effective assignment to intervention is to choose the result corresponding to an analysis that adheres to ITT principles, except that participants with missing outcome data are excluded. Sometimes that is described as a modified intention to treat analysis. Now, that analysis does not prevent bias due to missing outcome data, but bias due to missing outcome data is assessed in the domain on bias due to missing outcome data, and so it does not concern us when we're assessing bias due to deviations from intended interventions. The third choice, if it's the only one reported by the trial authors, is to assess a result corresponding to an as-treated or a naive per protocol analysis, or an analysis from which eligible trial participants have been excluded by the trial authors. Unsurprisingly, such an analysis may be at higher risk of bias in this domain. Back to the risk of the role of blinding, which we discussed earlier on. Provided that the analysis is appropriate, in blinded trials, risk of bias due to deviations from intended intervention will be low in ROB2. There is nothing further to consider. In unblinded trials, risk of bias due to deviations from intended intervention will usually be low, although, as some of you said, it will sometimes be high. And this is because the effective assignment to intervention in unblinded trials depends on the net effect combining the effect of the interventions and the degree and type of adherence to these interventions. Now, there are only two types of deviation from intended intervention that are considered in ROB2 to lead to a risk of bias. And that's why even in unblinded trials, it may well be that risk of bias due to deviations from intended intervention is usually assessed to be low in ROB2. The two types of deviations from intended intervention that are considered to lead to a risk of bias in ROB2 are whether the process of recruiting and engaging with participants affected their behavior. For example, I recruited participants, I told them all about the dangers of their condition and the potential benefits of the experimental intervention, and then because of that recruitment process, participants went and sought the experimental intervention. And secondly, if trial personnel undermine trial comparisons by implementing non-protocol interventions or failing to implement the protocol interventions in a manner that arose because of the trial context. So, for example, unconscious processes, for example, the trial personnel had a strong belief that one intervention was more effective than another, or conscious processes. For example, they had a financial conflict of interest and so acted in a way that tended to produce a result that matched their conflict of interest. There will be a high risk of bias if deviations arose because of the trial context in the way that I described on the previous slide, and they affect the outcome, and they're not balanced between the intervention groups. And I think at this point I'm going to hand over to Julian, who's going to explain the signalling questions and how they lead to risk of bias judgments in ROB2.
Thank you, Jonathan. So I hope everyone is familiar with how ROB2 works from looking at it or a previous webinar, in that within each of these domains, we address them with a series of signalling questions asking about what happened, and we turn those into a risk of bias judgment for the domain. So here are the 7 signaling questions that we've put together to help us think about risk of bias when we're looking at the effect of assignment to intervention. The first 2 are around the area of blinding. We phrased them not using the term blinding because there can be an attempt to blind, but it might be broken, and that makes things difficult. So we asked the direct question: were participants aware of their assigned intervention during the trial? Either because they were blinded, well, that would have to be blinded, but they may be aware. Sorry, mixed up. They may be aware either because there was no blinding or because blinding failed for some reason, so leading to no blinding. And the second question about the carers and the people delivering the intervention being aware. So the first 2 around blinding. The next 3 address the idea of deviations arising from the trial context. The first one is the basic question: were there deviations from intended intervention arising because of the trial context? And that will be for one of the 2 reasons Jonathan talked about. Either the participants behaved in such a way that they would not behave outside of the trial, or the intervention providers did something that undermined the comparison. And if there were, then we proceed to ask whether these deviations were likely to have affected the outcome, drawing on what Jonathan said in just the previous slide. And if they were, we go then on to ask whether they were balanced between groups. The last 2 questions address a slightly different issue. They're going to the analysis and asking essentially whether an intention to treat analysis was done. And we've asked that question in the form: was an appropriate analysis used to estimate the effect of assignment to intervention? And if there was not an appropriate analysis, then we want to ask whether it really made a difference, whether there was potential for substantial impact on the result of the failure to analyze participants in the groups to which they were randomized. So 7 questions with essentially yes/no responses. And in the next slide, thanks, Jonathan.
So I just wanted to make one point, Julian, just to note everybody, the implications of blinding are that questions 2.3, 2.4, and 2.5 are only asked if either participants or carers and people delivering the intervention were aware of participants' assigned intervention during the trial. So if blinding was implemented and was successful, we assume that there were no deviations from the intended intervention that arose because of the trial context. So blinding is still important when we assess deviations from the intended intervention in ROB2, but we don't simply assume high risk of bias in the absence of blinding. In the absence of blinding, we think about deviations from intended intervention that arose because of the trial context. Sorry, Julian.
Thank you. So you have to pay attention here, Jonathan. There'll be lots of clicking. So
I'm alert.
Good. Here's the algorithm that we've put together to reach a proposed judgment about risk of bias in this domain. Click. So here are the questions on the screen. The easy route to think about is low risk of bias. Click. We get to that if everyone was blinded. That's the simplest route, and we can stop worrying. We don't need to worry about deviations from the trial context if everyone was blinded, as Jonathan just said. The next easy route to think about is how we get to high risk of bias. To get to high risk of bias, we've got to have some people that are unblinded, and then some evidence or some reason to believe that there were deviations because of the trial context that affected outcome and that were not balanced between groups. So we get to high risk of bias. Then we can think about another way to get to low risk of bias is that if we do not think there were deviations that arose because of the trial context. Now, that's one of the most challenging questions in the tool, I have to say. And some of the time we will just not know whether there were deviations or whether deviations that happened didn't reflect the trial context. And so we would, if we're in the presence of no information, which is another response option, we'd probably end up with some concerns for this part of the domain. If there were deviations arising from the trial context, then if they didn't affect the outcome, or they were balanced between groups, we would probably still have some concerns. That's That's what those two last green arrows reflect. So it's a domain in two parts. The second part addresses the analysis part. If there was an appropriate analysis, we'd be at low risk of bias for that part. If there was an inappropriate analysis and there was a potential for a substantial impact, i.e. quite a lot of people were moved or not analyzed in their randomized groups, we could be at high risk of bias. And in between the two, if there was some inappropriate analysis, but it was not a big magnitude of problem, we'd have some concerns. And we put these two domains together in much the same way as we combine things across domains in the tool. If they're both low, the domain's at low. If either is high, the domain's at high risk of bias. Anything else would be at some concerns. So
beautifully explained, Julian.
Right, thank you. So at that point, I think we should start looking at some questions and try and leave some time to go through the effect of adhering to intervention. So I'm just perusing those. So there are a few around missing data issues. So should we use imputed ITT analyses or those that exclude patients with missing data? And what would you say to a completer analysis or where all patients with missing data at endpoint are excluded? I think the point here is that, and someone raised the point that the third part of the intention to treat effect, where we have an outcome on everybody, then that is addressed in the missing outcome data domain. So I can see a potential for a bit of a confusion here, because the principles of ITT are essentially addressed in two parts of the tool. The keeping people in the groups to which they were allocated is addressed here. Whereas if we have no outcome data, we cannot include them in the analysis. There we have missing outcome data. That's addressed in domain 3 on missing data, which we'll talk about next month.
So I'm just, okay, so just let me quickly try to address some of these other questions. So there's a question with regard to modified intention to treat considered as an appropriate analysis. If missing outcome data is due to loss of follow-up, is that not similar to a per protocol analysis? I think our answer to that is no, it is not. A per protocol analysis is where we, or a naive per protocol analysis, is where we exclude participants on the basis that they did not receive the intervention. And that's a separate issue from loss to follow-up. Just to be clear, we're not saying loss to follow-up may not, so loss to follow-up may cause bias. We all agree about that. It's just not assessed in the domain bias due to deviations from intended interventions. It's assessed in the next domain, bias due to missing outcome data. And then there's a question, aware of what? Let me just try and understand. So it's quite a long question.
It's a long one. Thanks, Toshi.
Do you want to? Are you in a position to answer it? Have you read it, Julian?
No, it's too long for me to digest in these circumstances.
Impressive that you managed to put all that in the chat, Toshi. I think aware of the intervention to which you assigned. So a quick answer, if I've understood your question correctly, is that if a deception was approved and successful, then participants would be considered to be blinded. But I'm not sure about the particular example you're given. Double-blinded trial with an intervention that produces obvious side effects. That is an example in which we would say, yeah, sure, participants, even despite the blinding, became aware of the intervention received, but that doesn't necessarily lead to a risk of bias. It simply leads us to answer questions 2.3, 2.4, and 2.5. It's unavoidable in reality, but in ROB2, there is only a very limited range of situations, deviations arising from the trial context, in which lack of blinding or a failure of blinding leads to high risk of bias. I would go so far as to say that usually there will be no evidence that deviations that arose because of the trial context, for example, evidence that participants changed their behavior because of recruitment activities, or that investigators consciously or unconsciously undermined the trial comparisons, and it will be reasonable to say that the risk of bias was low. When a study is only described as double-blind with no further information about the method of blinding and blinding was successful, would I tend to believe or not that blinding was successful? Thanks for the question, Johannes. What I'd say there is that an important part of ROB2 is that we have no information answers. So in that context, if it was described as double blind and the method of blinding, and we don't know whether blinding was successful, we might answer no information and be led to some concerns at that point. Julian, do you want to add to that?
No, that was good answer to that one. Toshi, I see, has put his question in a nutshell. So the question about awareness to intervention, is it about awareness of the intervention or awareness of the tested hypothesis?
And our answer is awareness of the intervention. Oh, great question, Massimiliano. In a non-inferiority trials, an ITT analysis should be avoided. I don't think we would say that. And this is where everything gets very confusing. An intention to treat analysis. Let's be, and I'd strongly recommend refer you to the detailed guidance on ROB2 when we think about the issue of where we said something about non-inferiority trials and ITT analysis. An intention for a placebo-controlled randomized trial in which some participants did not adhere to their assigned intervention. An intention to treat analysis will be conservative compared to the effect of adhering to intervention. The result we get will be closer to the null, usually, than the effect we would have seen had all participants adhered to intervention. Now, the problem in non-inferiority trials is that we're actually interested in evidence of the difference. And so in the presence of substantial non-adherence to intervention, when we're concerned that the intention to treat effect is much closer to the null than the effect of adhering to intervention, an ITT analysis can be considered problematic. But we would not say that an ITT analysis should be avoided. Simply doing a naive per protocol analysis because you're in a non-inferiority situation does not mean no bias in the naive per protocol analysis. It may well be that you should consider appropriate ways, if possible, if they're feasible, to estimate the effect of adhering to intervention. Is it okay for a reviewer to consider a modified ITT analysis? Yes, if no full ITT analysis is available because, for example, some participants were lost to follow-up and the outcomes could not be measured in those participants, then you should consider the modified ITT analysis, and then in the next domain, you assess the risk of bias due to missing outcome data.